critical issue.
Thank you so much. Thank you for not only talking the talk, but walking the walk each and every day. Let me ask now Congressman Delaney from Maryland to come forward, and thank you so much for your tremendous leadership and for being here with us tonight.
I want to thank the gentlelady for giving me this time this afternoon and for her leadership on this issue. Mr. Speaker, as we all know, today marks that historic day, the 50-year anniversary of President Johnson declaring a formal war on poverty. And on such a day, we must take note of the progress we've made and remind ourselves of the work that has to be done. Across 50 years, if you take into account the effects of programs this government has put in place to target those on poverty, we have significantly reduced the rate of poverty. We have, in particular, reduced the rate of poverty for our seniors. These facts are first evidence of the notion that the government can make a difference against this problem. But we also know that more has to be done. 50 million Americans live in poverty, including about a quarter of which are our children, our most vulnerable citizens, children who have their whole lives in front of them and are struggling in poverty. We must make a difference against this, and to do that we need to do three things. First, we need to continue to fund the programs that are proven to make a difference in the lives of those living in poverty, like food stamps, like funding Head Start. Second, we need to raise the minimum wage in this country. Right now, in 2014, in the wealthiest country in the world, in many states, if you work 40 hours a week and earn the minimum wage, you live below the poverty line. That just doesn't pass the look yourself in the mirror test. The minimum wage has significantly, for decades, trailed the growth in our economy. We need to raise the minimum wage. That will make a meaningful and impactful difference in the lives of those struggling in poverty. And finally, we need to create jobs. Jobs are the most direct way to lift people out of poverty, and through a job, people have personal dignity. To make a difference in the jobs crisis in this country, we need to invest in education. Across the long term, that will make a disproportionate difference in terms of the number of people living in poverty. But in the short term, we need to do things to get people to work now, like investing in our infrastructure. This is very important work for us to do, Mr. Speaker. I'll close by reflecting on some of the words of President Johnson. He said this fight would not be short and easy, and he was right. We've been at this for 50 years. He also said no single weapon would suffice, and he was right about that as well. We need to be raising the minimum wage. We need to be investing in jobs. We need to be funding critical programs like food stamps and Head Start. And then he said, we must not rest until this war is done. And to honor the tens of millions of people who have lived, unfortunately, in poverty over the last 50 years, and the tremendous number of people who have fought this battle, and to live up to the standard of our Maker, we must recommit ourselves to this battle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Let me now yield to Representative Dan Kildee from Michigan, my good friend who constantly, throughout his life actually, has been waging this war on poverty. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and I thank the gentlelady from California, Mrs. Lee, for her leadership and her stewardship of this important obligation that we're here to commemorate. Mr. Speaker, it was 50 years ago today that President Johnson stood at that podium right in front of us, and I can still conjure, just the images of that speech. Of course, these are images of black and white recordings of President Johnson standing there, and it reminds me of the special obligation that we are called to and that he articulated so well half a century ago. I was 5 years old when he gave that speech, but like many I know here, I was sort of a precocious kid, and I was really interested in our government and in politics, and I followed it from a very young age, even that tender age of 5. But I remember as a kid in the 1960s and early 1970s going through school thinking that the great struggles, the civil rights struggle, the women's movement, this war on poverty were the big fights of our generation. And in some ways, I almost felt at that point in time that a moment had passed me by, never imagining that when the time came so many years later that I would have an opportunity to serve in Congress, that we're actually still fighting those same fights, that we're still engaged in that same struggle. 50 years later, after President Johnson's speech, in the wealthiest society ever imagined, we're still fighting this war on poverty. And in fact, we're seeing recently growing disparity, growing inequality in our society. We have not eradicated poverty. In fact, we haven't yet gotten to the point where we can say we're close. But we do continue that battle. The battle over unemployment insurance, for example, is a part of that same fight. Some in this body would choose to continue their crusade to cut that important program. We have to remind ourselves that 11 million, just since 2008, 11 million Americans have been saved from poverty because they were able to have that unemployment insurance available to keep them whole until they could find new, meaningful, rewarding work. So instead of cutting these important programs, Head Start, our nutrition programs, the programs that actually change the trajectory of the lives of those who are struggling to find their way in our society, we ought to be doubling those investments. We ought to be making sure that no American ever has to wonder if they will fall below that common floor of decency that we all would agree should be part of any civilized society. We should have a minimum wage in this country that guarantees that people who work full-time don't live in poverty. 50 years later, we've got a lot of work to do. And I heard the other day, I'll close by saying this, I heard the other day a member of the other body make a comment that perhaps we ought to simply acknowledge that in this nation we have lost the war on poverty. When 50 years ago, a quarter of our society was living in poverty, and today that number is 16%. While we know we have a long way to go, we know that these programs actually do work. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of country, what kind of society do we want to be? And I think if we answer the question right, we will live up to the challenge that President Johnson laid down 50 years ago. I yield back. Thank you.
Let me ask you, Mr. Speaker, how much time do we have remaining?
Time remaining. 17 minutes.
17 minutes.
Has remaining.
Thank you. We have many members who still would like to speak, which really lets us know the importance of this issue. Congresswoman Grace Meng from New York, freshman from New York who has hit the ground running, is representing her constituents in a bold and brilliant way. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and I again also want to thank the gentlelady from California for her tremendous efforts in speaking up and advocating for so many people who are voiceless. Mr. Speaker, I come before you today to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. Our nation has had many successes over the last 50 years. Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP, and Pell Grants are incredible programs that help our entire country. However, even with these successful programs, which deserve our recognition, this is not a time for celebration. After 5 decades, many would think that our congressional leaders were still committed to fighting poverty and reducing the gap between the haves and have-nots. I would still think that we are committed to helping hard-working Americans who have fallen on rough times and through no fault of their own. The war on poverty is far from over. Instead of pressing the issue, we are retreating from it. 1.3 million Americans just lost their unemployment insurance and are suffering from long-term joblessness. If we don't renew the program, 383,000 New Yorkers will lose access to benefits over the next 12 months. We would also be responsible for preventing an increase of GDP by 0.2% and the blocking of 200,000 jobs. For me, and I know for many in this chamber, inflicting avoidable pain on this country is unacceptable. With no political gimmicks, we must vote to renew unemployment insurance now. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much for yielding back. And let me ask and yield now to Congressman Pete DeFazio from Oregon, who has some stories he'd like to tell about his constituents and what they're going through.
Thank you, gentlelady. On the 50th anniversary, the Republicans just got it a little bit wrong. War on poverty, they thought it was the war for poverty, as they are dismantling one by one the most important programs that help lift and keep people out of poverty, like extended unemployment insurance. Let me read a few subjects here. Roseburg, Oregon. A 61-year-old woman working since she was 14. I don't know if it's my age, but I'm having great difficulty finding a job. A 62-year-old woman from Coos Bay, Oregon, went back to her former employer, said, "Are you hiring?" He said, "You can't be serious. Not at this time of year. Come back in the spring." Unfortunately, she can't make it till spring. A Eugene veteran, a two-income family, but she lost her job. "Since I haven't been able to find a job, we're close to losing our house and declaring bankruptcy. I'm actively seeking employment every day." And then we go to Springfield, Oregon, my hometown. We have a woman whose son is in the Army, and she says, "I can't find a job. I've been looking. I have to give notice to my landlord and become homeless." And then Corvallis, Oregon, 54-year-old man, been working his whole life since 17, and his last job, he was there for 13 years. But he can't find a job, and he's going to be forced into homelessness. And then finally, another gentleman from Springfield, Oregon. $330 a week I received wasn't much, but it helped keep me from having to go to food banks and asking for help. We went just before Christmas. The food bank had run out of food. I have to decide now whether to buy medicine or food or heat my house. That's the legacy of the cruel cuts of these Republicans. These are people, hardworking Americans, lost their jobs through no fault of their own. They want to work, but if they fall into poverty, they lose their home, they lose their cell service, their telephone, their car. How are they ever going to get a job? We need to help them now before they fall even more off the cliff. Extend unemployment benefits today as a celebration that we as the American people do not tolerate poverty in this country.
Thank you for that very powerful statement and for sharing those stories. All of us have stories very similar, but thank you for your constituent testimonies. Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, I'd like to yield to now from Ohio. Privileged to serve with Congresswoman Kaptur on the Appropriations Committee, who constantly speaks for the voiceless. Thank you for being here.
Congresswoman Lee of Oakland, thank you so much for raising consciousness of a nation again. And I rise to join my colleagues tonight in support of raising consciousness about how important the programs have been over the years to reduce poverty in our country since the half-century-old effort of the War on Poverty started by Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, who wanted to replace despair with opportunity. And I would like to ask unanimous consent to place in the record an executive summary of the Council of Economic Advisors dated January 2014 that summarizes the great progress that has been made, poverty in our country declining by more than a third since 1967 because of important programs that Democrats created: Social Security, Medicare, the Earned Income Tax Credit, unemployment compensation, which is being tested as we speak here today. The Speaker from Ohio, where unemployment has just gone up, should bring up that bill to extend unemployment benefits that impacts millions of Americans across our country. People who understand the value of work, they don't want any subsidy. They want a job. They want a job. The most important work we can do is to create jobs, but when they can't get a job, then to give them their earned benefits. What is great about this evening is, I was thinking back to the 1960s. I was pretty young back then, but there was a book written by Michael Harrington, The Other America, and for whatever reason, maybe it was because President Kennedy was president, that book became almost like a small Bible, and people read it, and it raised their consciousness. I can remember President Kennedy campaigning in the mines in West Virginia and raising consciousness again about the conditions of miners and what they were enduring. It's very important that we have that same kind of effort across our country to raise consciousness about how important these programs are for our children, for our seniors, for those who are out of work. And by working together, we as a people really do make a difference. And so, Congresswoman Lee, I want to thank you tonight for being part of that clarion call to raise consciousness of people who really care. The majority of Americans really do. And as they are listening to Wall Street announce bigger and bigger and bigger bonuses, they know that there's a war on the middle class right now. And so many Americans are falling out of that middle class. They know something is wrong. They want us to champion jobs here in Washington, D.C., and they want to make sure that that safety net is there for them if they hit the skids. And so I just thank you so very much for doing this. I thank all of my colleagues who took the time tonight to be here and to issue a clarion call for consciousness for jobs in this country, for extending unemployment benefits, for maintaining Social Security, for maintaining the Earned Income Tax Credit, and making sure that our vigilant efforts continue to eliminate poverty in this country. Thank you, and I yield my remaining time back.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's request is granted.
Thank you very much for that very powerful statement, Congresswoman Capter. I'd like now to yield to our assistant leader, my good friend, Congressman Clyburn from the great state of South Carolina, who constantly and consistently talks about prioritizing and targeting resources to area of need to the poor and low-income communities. Thank you for being here.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding me the time, Mr. Speaker. When President Johnson stood in this chamber 50 years ago and declared war on poverty, the richest country in the world had a poverty rate of 19%. President Johnson cautions us on that evening that the war on poverty would be a long one and not an easy one. Yet, 9 years later, 1973, the poverty rate in this country had dropped to 11%. We were most definitely winning the war on poverty. Unfortunately, after its initial success, many politicians found success running down the achievements the war on poverty had on many Americans. Politicians started scapegoating, calling out welfare queens, further the narrative that the war on poverty was not worth fighting. Yet I can show you firsthand examples in my home state of South Carolina where the war on poverty did in fact succeed. For example, Medicare and Medicaid, both war on poverty initiatives, have made a tremendous difference in the health security of older Americans and those of modest means. In fact, at the time of the institution of Medicare, the poverty rate among seniors was over 30%. Today, the poverty rate among seniors has dropped to beneath 10%. It's important to remember that a year after President Johnson made that speech, we passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That, to me, was to empower poor people, to empower people of color to go to the polls, get registered, and vote to make their own statements as to how to fight the war on poverty. Today, we in the Congressional Black Caucus have been calling for our government to do across the board what we did in our so-called stimulus bill, and that is to institute a 10-20-30 initiative to direct funds to targeted areas so that 10% of all this money can go into those communities where 20% or more of the population have been locked beneath the poverty level for the last 30 years. If we were to begin to target these persistent poverty counties, we will, in fact, eliminate poverty, and we can see all of our people living in poverty get beneath the 10% that we think will be tolerable over the next 10 years. Thank you so much for allowing me the time, and now you're back.
Thank you so much for being here with us and for your leadership, Mr. Clyburn. Let me yield now to the gentlelady from Texas, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Mr. Speaker, how much time do we have remaining?
We have 1 minute.
One.
I want to thank the gentlelady from California for her leadership, and simply we can begin to attack poverty in 2014 by extending the unemployment benefits for 1.3 million Americans. But thank you, President Johnson, as we honor the fight against the poverty that has encompassed so many Americans. The war on poverty is a war to be won. We thank you for VISTA, child nutrition, National School Lunch, food stamp program, community action programs, Indian Reservation legal services. I served on the board of the Gulf Coast Legal Services. And we say to our colleagues, if you would look at the red that is on these sheets, you will know that poverty does not belong to any one member. It belongs to all members. All states have individuals who are living below the poverty line. It is time to continue the fight against poverty and to ensure through unemployment insurance, through job training, through a supplemental nutrition program, through child care and Head Start, a vital transition of opportunity for poor children. It is time to continue that fight, and it is our pledge that along with legislation that I intend to introduce to give enhanced training to those who are chronically unemployed, it is our commitment to keep the dream of President Johnson alive and to extinguish poverty as we know it in the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have Congresswoman Schakowsky, Green, and Bishop here who would like to insert their records into the statement. We had an overwhelming number of members who attended, and they did not have the opportunity to speak tonight.
Without objection, general leave will be granted on this special order.
Thank you very much.
Gentlelady's time has expired. By the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Marino, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise to continue to bring attention to an issue that is devastating the people of Pennsylvania across the 10th District and other districts in Pennsylvania and across this country. Implementation of the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012. It has unintentionally burdened lower and middle-class homeowners and small businesses. Rates have increased astronomically. Biggert-Waters had the best of intentions. However, FEMA's methodology is severely flawed, and FEMA failed to warn Congress. This afternoon I am joined by a bipartisan group of my colleagues from across the country, and while the details of our proposed solution may vary, I believe we are unified behind the goal, protecting the livelihood and investments of hardworking Americans. Our homes are often our most valuable assets. It allows us to retire. It allows us to send our children to college. It allows us to leave something behind for our children and our grandchildren for a better life. These homes form the backbone of riverside and coastal working-class communities. The downfall of these residential real estate markets will be catastrophic. Homeowners will lose their total investment in their property. Small business will lose their customers, not to mention their real estate. Small banks will go out of business because people are not able to pay the insurance that the mortgage calls for. The community left behind will no longer have an adequate tax base to fund basic services. I believe the best solution right now is to repeal Biggert Waters in its entirety and start again from square one. Authors of the law in the House Financial Service Committee intended to stabilize the National Flood Insurance Program, but this law has disproportionately affected low and middle-class homeowners who cannot afford these premiums. Although we here in Congress tend to think in abstract terms, I want to share some of the stories I have heard from my neighbors back home in the 10th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. Jeff and Erica Waldman purchased a house in Muncie, Pennsylvania. Flood insurance premium was initially $900 per year. Now they are being told to pay, by the end of last year, the 31st, a few days ago, $9,000 a year for flood insurance, up front. Jeff and Erica are frustrated about the lack of information they were given, days away from losing their home as we speak. We cannot solely place this burden on people like Jeff and Erica. Lori and Michael Portanova purchased 3 historic properties in Jersey Shore, Pennsylvania last year. Hopefully that their new business would rejuvenate the Main Street feel for the borough. Flood insurance premium per year was $2,800 a year. They got a notice that they had to pay $40,000 by the end of the year for flood insurance, by the end of 2013. Close to walking away from their investments and taking a huge loss. This would also have devastating consequences on other property owners in Jersey Shore who will have an additional tax burden if homeowners in the area are not able to keep their homes because they're not able to pay the flood insurance. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Congressman Thompson.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the gentleman for yielding, and I appreciate my good friend from Pennsylvania for hosting this special orders on a very serious issue. You know, Biggert Waters, I think, was a piece of legislation that we all had great hopes in terms of as the National Flood Insurance Program, as the commercial insurance industry really exited the insuring of flood risk. It was left to the federal government, and as that and then with recent flooding, obviously, over the past number of years, that fund being decimated. Congress last year, on a bipartisan basis, passed the Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012, and the measure included some long overdue reforms that strengthened the financial solvency and administrative efficiency of the National Flood Insurance Program. The rationale for the 2012 law was the need for a National Flood Insurance Program to more accurately reflect flood risk. Historically, most low-risk states subsidized higher risk, mostly coastal states. Similarly, low-risk areas within the states tended to subsidize those areas with higher risk, which were more prone to flooding. The linchpin of the 2012, however, law was to use true actuarial rates in order to prevent very low-risk areas from subsidizing moderate to high-risk rates. The unintended consequences have been drastic premium increases for those plans that were traditionally subsidized by the National Flood Insurance Program. Under the law, Congress mandated that the Federal Emergency Management Agency complete an affordability study to further evaluate any unintended consequences as a result of the changes. The study was to be completed before the rates increase went into effect. I want to repeat that. The law that was passed in 2012 had a safeguard in there that the administration, through FEMA, the agency FEMA, was to do affordability studies before rates went up. Well, that's not what happened, Mr. Speaker. That would have been critical to understanding the full scope of the new risk model. And FEMA's failed to complete the affordability study that was required under the law. Additionally, it remains a huge concern that FEMA does not have the data it needs to accurately determine risk under this new policy regime, and is incapable of creating a new mapping system that truly reflects true actuarial rates. Now, while 80% of the policyholders in this country will not see an increase as a result of the new policy, a small portion of properties, actually I think it's a significant portion of properties in this country, are being hit with staggering increases. This is a serious concern for communities and individuals across the country, including many from the 5th District of Pennsylvania. Just recently, hearing from counties, communities, homeowners from Cameron County and Erie County, Clinton, McKean, Crawford, Potter, Huntington Center, and that's just recent days. These are individuals, and I think we're at risk of creating ghost towns where homes have lost so much value that you're not able to purchase. You may afford the mortgage, but you can't afford the flood insurance. And individuals who find themselves in a situation of that, as my good friend said, the number one asset that individuals have in their lives is their property, their home, their real estate. And when it comes time to be able to sell that, they're not able to liquidate it because there's no one out there that's able to buy. So we're really at risk, unless we take necessary changes to, I think, to have the administration comply with the law as it was passed in 2012 in terms of affordability rates of creating these ghost towns. Now, colleagues on both sides of the aisle have come together to correct this critically important issue. Now, I'm original co-sponsor of the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act, H.R. 3370. I know my good friend Mr. Marino has introduced another bill that would completely repeal Biggers Waters, most recently introduced within the past couple of days. H.R. 3370 is a bill to terminate the rate increase under the flood insurance emergency management to terminate the rate increases under the Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012 until 2 years after the Federal Emergency Management completes the rate affordability study originally mandated by the law. Now, the bill also makes structural changes to FEMA to assure that there's advocates for homeowners when flood maps are drawn or adjusted. Now, Mr. Speaker, improving the financial viability of the nation's flood insurance program while ensuring that program protects those it was designed to support is something every member of this body should support. Mr. Speaker, I encourage my colleagues to join in this common-sense effort to protect and improve our nation's flood insurance program, but also make sure that our real estate market remains strong and viable, and those assets, that important asset that individuals have, remains being able to buy and to be able to sell. And I thank the gentleman for hosting this special orders. And I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Thompson. I would like to add a true story happening right now in my district due to these increases in rates. Nikki Burrows and her husband bought their home in Muncie in 2006. Insurance premiums more than doubled from $862 to $1,750. But because the Burrows had suffered flood damage from Tropical Storm Lee in 2011, they are subject to an additional 20% on their premiums until they max out at an annual fee of $4,000 annually. So in essence, they went from $862 a year to $4,000 a year because they were hit in one of the floods. These boroughs are trapped. These townships and small towns along the rivers are trapped into a situation where the average mean income is about $37,000. That's before taxes. That's before mortgage payment. That's before food for the kids. That's before other insurances. But yet these people are to come up with $4,000 and $6,000 and $8,000 and $10,000 up front per year for flood insurance because of the unintended consequences of Biggert Waters. At this time, I yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, my colleague across the aisle, Congressman Keating, former prosecutor.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. And in an all too common occurrence in this nation today, the Murphy family in Wareham, Massachusetts, is seeing flood insurance premiums rise dramatically from $500 annually in their instance to $5,000, a 10-time amount of an increase. Anthony Frangi, who's a realtor in the South Shore portion of Massachusetts, has seen multiple home sales fall through specifically because the flood insurance premiums were too high. This is a real estate industry, not just in my home state, but across the country, that has been reeling as a result of the worst downturn in the housing industry in recent years that our country has ever experienced. They're beginning to come forward. Sales are occurring. One of our most important industries, our housing industry, is beginning to drive our economy forward. Yet this is going to drive us back. The lending institutions that support this in states like Florida, where the inventory was so high, where they had houses that people walked away from because they couldn't afford and they couldn't sell themselves, now they have experienced improvement, but this is going to set them back. And it's going to hurt our economy in the process, not just regionally, but nationally. Last year, the owners of Haddad's Ocean Cafe and the community I represent of Marshfield renovated their restaurant to reflect the current flood requirements, and they went further. They even went higher when they made these kind of very expensive renovations, going above what was needed. Today, with the new flood maps, they must pay millions of dollars in additional renovations to further rise the building even higher, or pay flood insurance premiums far in excess of $30,000 annually, something that endangers their ability to conduct basic business. These are just a few of the numerous examples and challenges facing homeowners and businesses that have arisen through the implementation of the new flood insurance changes. And FEMA, at hearings that we've had here in answering to this issue about the implementation, has said they perceive their job to overestimate the impact of this. Clearly, there's something wrong with the implementation of this law. Our office has had individual after individual come forward to us with things that affect their own persons and their own homes, looking for help. Some of them that can afford it have moved forward with appeals. And many of those appeals have been successful. Yet they've had to invest and risk thousands of dollars in elevation studies, in terms of site reviews, just to bring their case forward. Communities have gone together and brought forth appeals for the entire community. One of those communities in my district went forward, and they were so detailed, I looked at what they said and decided to bring it to the attention and to ask the advice and expertise of one of the nation's top coastal expert groups, and that's the University of Massachusetts School of Marine Science and Technology in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. What they determined with their review was that the methodology used to determine these maps was faulty. In fact, one of the things they found was the wave structure that results in flooding that is the result of storm surges and violent storms in the east Atlantic coast and responsible for the floods. That wasn't used as the methodology to determine what the impact would be on the maps and what the costs would be for flood insurance on all these homeowners. Indeed, they used the methodology based on the Pacific Ocean with a longer, slower wave structure, and the scientists and coastal engineers that reviewed this for us said what they determined to be the maps was based on faulty science. Now, individuals are facing enormous burdens, as my colleagues have so aptly demonstrated, in terms of annual payments that could be the difference between being able to stay in your own home, live in your own home, or not. Annual payments that affect many people on fixed income who had never, ever budgeted for this, and are throwing them into the most difficult decisions of how they're going to heat their home, how they're going to afford to live, what they're going to do. Even younger people who are using or hoping to use the equity on their home to pay for their kids' college education are finding that instead of having this go towards that important goal in their life, it's going to pay for flood insurance. Now, this is an important thing not only how it affects people in annual payments, but what this also does. This affects and can affect the entire value of their home. In fact, real estate people are finding, as they're going to sell their homes, that the homes that were valued one way are now dramatically being reduced because of the cost of annual flood insurance attached to that home. So what we have really is a taking as a result of the implementation of this, a taking of people's assets, of their savings, of the roof over their head, of the number one financial asset they have in their lives. And clearly this is not the role of government, to effectuate this kind of taking, because maybe the map is totally wrong and they shouldn't be included at all, or maybe it's off just 1 foot. And it has this kind of devastating financial and personal impact. That's why I've joined our colleagues in being one of the original sponsors of the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act. Now, this is done in a House that's often challenged in terms of working across the aisle, in terms of working in a bipartisan manner. But in this instance, it's a sterling example of how we have worked together across the aisle in a common interest, realizing how important this is to the people we represent, realizing how important this is to the real estate industry nationally, realizing how important this is to the lending institutions nationally, and making sure that government isn't acting in a way that is actually seizing their personal assets and their life savings. We have an obligation, having worked together so hard, and in my opinion, achieving a very significant majority of the members of this House of Representatives, to pass this kind of delay, to get it right, and make sure we're treating people fairly, that it is imperative that this bill be brought to the floor for a vote, and be brought to the floor quickly for a vote. We are expecting Senate action in this just in the next few weeks. It is my hope, it is my plea, it is our obligation as the court of last resort representing these people who have so much in jeopardy right now, to bring it to the floor, to get a vote, to pass it, to get a delay, to be able to make sure we go to FEMA and say, you're dealing with people's livelihoods. You have an obligation to get it right and get it done. And when they do, this bill will also allow us here in Congress to review it and make sure the implementation is continued in the correct manner. So let's move forward on this very important issue as soon as possible. Let's show this as one more example during these very, very challenging times politically of what happens when this House listens to the people in their district and around the country, works together to get something done, and does the right thing. It is my fervent hope that we can do this quickly. With that, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Congressman Keating. I would like to reiterate the devastating effects that these premiums are having on the values of homes, affecting retirement plans for a lot of our seniors in the district. Tom Rischel. Tom does not have a pension. He does not have a retirement plan. So he invested in several properties in Muncie, Pennsylvania, hoping to one day resell the properties. His premium on just one property has jumped from $600 a year to over $9,500 a year. Tom, who is 70 years old, fears his properties are worthless and his dreams of retirement have been destroyed. Mr. Speaker, at this time I yield to the gentleman from Mississippi, Congressman Palazzo.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you so much for putting this special order together this evening for us to talk about the devastating effects the Bigger Waters Act is going to have on flood insurance premiums, just not along coastal areas, but all across America. For more than 40 years, residents who have lived in flood-prone areas have paid into the National Flood Insurance Program because virtually no private flood insurance market existed. The issues I and my colleagues have spent so much time addressing over the last year affect these 5 million NFIP policyholders. But what many Americans do not realize is that they could be the next flood victim, and they could be the next victim of these drastic flood insurance hikes and flawed FEMA policies. According to FEMA Director Craig Fugate, 40% of the U.S. population lives in counties that border the ocean or the Great Lakes and are directly or indirectly affected by flood risk. And most U.S. counties contain rivers and streams that present flood hazards. 40% of the U.S. population, that's more than 126 million Americans that could be affected by these issues in the coming years. This map shows exactly where you can find NFIP policyholders. We're not just talking about a few people living in coastal areas. This isn't just Mississippi, Louisiana, New York, New Jersey, or Florida's problem. And this map hasn't even been updated to include those affected by the recent flooding in Colorado. We're talking about millions of people across America in every single state and just about every single congressional district who will be impacted by these drastic rate increases. The Biggert Waters Act of 2012 was passed with the intention of ensuring that the program remains solvent for these policyholders, to ensure that it's there for the people who have paid into the system when a disaster strikes. It was never intended to make rates so unaffordable that flood insurance is no longer attainable for these policyholders. Yet when you look at what is happening now and the way FEMA is implementing the law, that is exactly what we are seeing. There are those who have said these people are just a bunch of wealthy waterfront homeowners. That's simply not true. I can tell you that is not the case in my district. I'm hearing from teachers, veterans, fishermen, people who work at the shipyards in support of our Navy. These are everyday Americans, some of who live 50 or 100 miles or more inland. These are folks who have been responsible and maintained flood insurance policies for years and sunk untold thousands of dollars of their own funds into their community's recovery from Hurricane Katrina. They built back to higher FEMA standards. They built back to many of them invested in mitigation against future risk. They used every tool at their disposal and went to great lengths and great costs to comply with the law and do their part. And now they're being punished for doing that. They're being hit with astronomical rate increases overnight. Or worse, they're unable to get straight answers from FEMA or from their flood insurance agents who are looking to FEMA for answers. Many are retirement age. One bank in my district has estimated that at least 400 elderly homeowners are facing rate increases that are so drastic that it could force them into foreclosure. Take Cheryl, a retired special education teacher married to Gerald, a retired aluminum plant worker and a Navy veteran. She says, "Please don't think that we live in a waterfront home. We live in an older neighborhood miles inland." She tells me that for 11 months they lived in a camper while working to rebuild, taking extra precautions and meeting the demands of inspectors and permits throughout the process. We felt proud to be part of the rebuilding of the Mississippi Gulf Coast, she says, but she also tells me a large increase could bury us. Another military retiree couple on fixed incomes write that their flood insurance rates have been estimated to rise from $400 a year to at least $4,000 a year. He says, despite doing our homework prior to purchase, putting a considerable down payment on the home, doing due diligence following the storm by repairing our home, that flood map changes and increasing flood insurance rates have put them in the position of possibly to lose their home with no fallback. Linda, a 65-year-old single woman, tells me she hopes to retire this year after nearly 40 years working as a teacher. She says, like so many others, I rebuilt my home after Katrina, following the guidelines of then current flood maps. If the flood rates go to the proposed levels, there's no way I can afford to keep my home. I have worked all of my life, contributed to the community I live in, followed the rules, paid my debts. Now I am faced with losing my home, my retirement, and my sense of security. These are just a few examples of how these rate increases are affecting everyday Mississippians. Millions more like them are all across the nation, and some don't even realize the storm that is coming. We're not just talking about a few folks along the coast. We're not talking about wealthy waterfront homeowners looking for a taxpayer handout. Anyone who says otherwise is incredibly misinformed or blatantly misleading the American people. These people, they are the reason we are here today. They are the reason that Republicans and Democrats from every corner of the country are supporting our efforts. We all share the same goal of ensuring flood insurance remains affordable and available to those who need it. In this body, we have acted to make compassionate reforms while keeping this program fiscally sound. We've worked to halt rate increases, address unintended consequences, and hold FEMA accountable for questionable methods and flawed implementation. We will continue this fight for those who have been caught in the cracks through no fault of their own, for hard-working, everyday Americans who have followed all the rules and tried to do everything right. Now we have a responsibility to make this right, and we will not stop until the job's finished. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Congressman Palazzo. Your map says it all. You know, after speaking with many constituents during the recess, including 5 town halls that I held, I believe that many homeowners who have seen the rates increase were not even aware that the National Flood Insurance Program rates were partially subsidized by the federal government. And as the Congressman just said, please do not think that this pertains to California coast on the Pacific alone, or New Jersey or New York coastal. This affects people all across the United States. Just in the state of Pennsylvania alone, we're not on a coast, we're in by several hundred miles. There are several thousands of miles of waterways, rivers, creeks, streams. And just to give you an example, in one of the town meetings I asked Jeff and his wife, Jeff is from Muncie, Jeff and his wife bought a house, paid it off early, paid their taxes, kept their insurance up. Again, their insurance is going up from about $600 a year to $11,000 a year. And I said to Jeff, when you were at your closing, and the realtor's sitting with you, and the lawyer's sitting with you, and the bank is sitting with you, they came out to you and said, okay, now we need a check for the flood insurance because you have a federally backed loan and you're in a flood area. So he wrote out a check for $600 or $700. But I said, at that point, did anyone say to you that 2/3 of the cost of the flood insurance is subsidized by the federal government? He said, never. I said, did anyone say to you that that subsidy could go away someday? Never. Did anyone tell you that the rates were going up because of that subsidy? Never. So it's not fair to the American people who are not told ahead of time. This is before recent closings. And they have the rug pulled out from them. So we're saying, in essence, and again, this is an unintended consequences of bigger waters, but FEMA did not give us the right information. I believe they held information back. And we're saying to the American people who are on $35,000 a year or $40,000 a year annual income, who have to pay $10,000 up front, you know something? We had a subsidy for you yesterday, but guess what? It's not there today. And it's too bad that you may lose your house. We just cannot let that happen. And now it gives me great pleasure to yield to the gentleman from New York, Congressman Grimm.
I would like to thank my colleague, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak today and for his hard work on this important issue. You know, I rise today to discuss this urgent need for Congress to act as quickly as possible to delay these skyrocketing flood insurance premiums that right now are absolutely crippling homeowners in my district of Staten Island and Brooklyn, as well as across this entire great nation. You know, in 2012, we all know that Congress passed the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act, and that was an attempt to stabilize the National Flood Insurance Program. And that program does have problems. It finds itself in about $30 billion of debt. And while well-intentioned, this law has had absolutely devastating effects on homeowners across the country. They're seeing their premiums increased not just by hundreds, but in many cases by thousands of % each year, with more increases to come in the future. In my district alone, I met with hundreds of concerned citizens, homeowners. I have a senior who came to me with her bill for the new flood insurance and her old bill
The premium was $2,200 a year, and the new bill was $28,000. She's on a fixed income. She's not in a position to pay $28,000 a year, and unfortunately for her, she can't sell the property because the property's value doesn't warrant such an extravagant flood insurance premium, so no one will buy it, so she's trapped. I had a working class family come to me and show me a bill for $37,000. It's a working class family. That was their flood insurance premium. Again, what does that mean? It means they're trapped because they can't sell the house. No one's going to buy a modest home for $200,000 or $300,000 with flood insurance of $37,000 a year. So this situation cannot be allowed to continue, and it cannot be unaddressed. Last year, my district and the entire Northeast was devastated by Superstorm Sandy. Tens of thousands of my constituents found themselves actually homeless for the first time in their lives. Their lives were completely turned upside down. They were wondering whether they would rebuild at all, how they were going to move forward. Many of them literally lost everything they've ever known. Every worldly possession was gone. And they knew then, as we do now, it would be years before their lives would return to any form of normalcy. Many of these people, unfortunately, still have not moved back into their homes. Many of them are struggling to rebuild as we speak right now. So to ask these victims of a natural disaster who find themselves in an absolutely horrible position through no fault of their own to pay upwards of $15,000 a year or more in flood insurance premiums so soon after a natural disaster took everything from them amounts to nothing more than them being victimized again. If these premiums continue to go into effect, many of my constituents will find themselves unable to pay both their mortgage and their flood insurance. Their property will, in best case scenario, lose considerable value, but in the worst case scenario, become completely worthless. This is unacceptable. To many Americans, their home is the largest asset they're going to ever own in their lifetime. To essentially destroy the value of those assets through flood insurance premium increases amounts to one of the largest takings of private property in U.S. history. Thankfully, there is a solution. There's a solution that has been proposed in both houses of Congress, and which I'm very proud to say I'm one of the lead sponsors. H.R. 3370, the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act, which would halt these draconian rate increases. As of today, I can report that this common sense legislation has over 170 bipartisan co-sponsors, and that support is growing every single day. This legislation simply would delay these rate increases for up to 4 years, giving FEMA time to both complete the affordability study mandated under Biggert-Waters and to propose a framework to Congress to maintain the long-term affordability of flood insurance. That will give Congress the time to consider their proposals. If long-term affordability of flood insurance is not taken into account when setting future premiums, many Americans are simply going to stop paying for this important coverage. They're just not going to be able to do it. This will only serve to damage the fiscal soundness of the National Flood Insurance Program over the long term. An expansion in the number of uninsured homes will only increase the direct cost to the federal government for future natural disasters. It's common sense. It's mathematics. If people don't pay into the program, the cost of the federal government will go up the next time there's a natural disaster. It's that simple. So in closing, I'd like to urge my colleagues in supporting this vital legislation. The sooner that we act to delay these flood insurance rate increases, the sooner we can bring stability not only to the real estate market, but to our fragile economy. And we will be bringing much-needed relief to extremely nervous homeowners across this entire great nation. So I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend from Pennsylvania. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Grimm. How much time do I have?
The gentleman has 25 minutes remaining.
Good, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I hold in my hand here a report, a statement from the National Association of Realtors. Now, a moment ago, I quoted realtors being in a closing and lawyers being in a closing and banks being in a closing, small banks. These people are informing me they never were told about these increases. And I want to read a small section here from their statement dated November 19, 2013. There's a subtitle of "Home Buyers Were Not Warned." I quote, "Because FEMA delayed, then retroactively applied the purchase provisions of Section 205, many home buyers, specifically those who bought between the enactment of Biggert Waters and March 12th of 2013, were not warned of rate increases before purchasing their properties. Flood insurance policies were not labeled as subsidies. It's not their fault." Mr. Speaker, at this time, it gives me pleasure to introduce the gentleman from Louisiana, Congressman Cassidy.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the reform of the Biggert Waters Act. And let's first point out that the flood insurance program was reformed under Biggert Waters with the goal to make it both affordable and